I'd now like to welcome to the floor our next speaker, Kashif Khan, CEO of the DNA Company, who will be speaking on the topic of hacking your DNA to reverse chronic aging, chronic disease and slowing aging. It's a pleasure to have you with us today. The floor is yours.
Awesome. Hey guys, so really what we're going to look at is this new sort of world in genetics that's crossing over from hardcore genetics, meaning that this gene means this gene means that, and really only applying to genetic conditions and moving away from that to chronic disease. I'm going to show you a report that looks at one simple element, and we're going to talk about, I'll use breast cancer as an example. We all hear about the BRCA gene, right? We know that that's a scary thing to hear about for women. And we even have women that hear about getting a report about a certain version of the BRCA gene for which they would then go get a mastectomy to be preventative. So this is what we're saying. How do you go from genetics, meaning that a genetic condition that's directly tied or correlated to functional genomics, as why does the disease happen? You know, in the United States, 90%, I'm sure someone's spoken of this already, of the healthcare budget is spent on chronic disease, most of which is preventable. So how do we prevent? How do we use genetics to prevent? So there's looking at, again, the BRCA gene equals breast cancer. Let's prevent by mastectomy or staying ahead with regular mammograms and checking. Or there's what is going on in biochemistry that would actually lead to the breast cancer, because BRCA doesn't cause breast cancer. BRCA is a gene editing gene that fixes other and repairs other genes. And if it's failing, it's not doing its job of repairing, but something upstream or downstream is actually causing the problem. So we'll use that scenario as an example of, well, what causes the problem? We know that most women, get breast cancer in and around the menopause age. That's the most common age. And if we look at this map, we look at the sexual, hormone pathway. How do you go from progesterone to testosterone to estrogen, which is how you produce and clear hormones? In that process, there's a gene called CYP17A1, which can determine how quickly red light, very slow, yellow light, medium, green light, very fast, convert those progesterones into testosterone. And whether you're a man or a woman, you do the same thing. A man does it daily, a woman does it monthly in her monthly cycle. That's the difference. Once you've created these testosterones, you either clear them, you get rid of them, you convert some of them into DHT, which is that manly man version of testosterone. You have the ripped, striated muscle, but it also may affect your hair follicles, make you go bald, or you convert it into estrogen. So we have some women that we see at a very quick pace, green light, convert their progesterone into testosterone, so that initial pool of hormones is very full. These lights are red, so they don't go in either direction, and there's a green light here, so a lot of estrogen, right? They're estrogen dominant is what we call them. From there, you now don't clear the estrogen itself as in your menstrual cycle. You first convert it into a metabolite, 2, 4, or 16 hydroxyestrogen, one of the three. 2 is very healthy and clean. You want that. That's what a woman would prefer to have. 4 and 16 are highly toxic. So if you're producing a lot of estrogen and then you're converting into one of these before clearing, you're creating this toxic metabolite, right? So we're now looking from one gene means this to we're starting to paint the picture, the story of what is actually happening in biochemistry. This is the functional genomics versus genetics. This gene means this gene means that, versus how does the body work and what gene instructs each step. So now we've gotten to, you've now perhaps produced a toxic metabolite, 4 or 16, right? We then look at, well, how do you clear them? If we know that, you're doing a good job, a poor job in what metabolite you're creating, now this toxic insult is there causing damage to the cells. How well do you get rid of them? These are the genes, COMT, GSTT, GSTP, SAW2, that get rid of those toxic metabolites. You may have a medium version. You're doing an okay job. You may have green, which is not, you're doing a really good job. Or these could all be red lights, which you would be surprised. It's not a 2 or 3% problem. This is like a 25 to 30% problem where people don't clear the toxic metabolites that well. In fact, this gene here, GSTT1, forget about a variant or a version. You might not even have the gene. It's possible to have what's called a copy number variation, meaning it's not just about a SNP or a variant, but you didn't actually get the gene, so that instruction isn't there and you don't do this step of the process. Now, if we go back to, I'm estrogen dominant, I produce a toxic metabolite, and I don't get rid of it. We've now looked at the entire cascade from beginning to end. Forget about BRCA and forget about a single gene that points to a 80% chance of likelihood of something, but you don't know, am I 80 or 20? You have to also study the 20%. Why did they not get the disease? Then you have to study the 80% to understand why did they get it. So in this scenario, if I produce the high, if I'm first of all estrogen dominant with a lot of estrogen, producing a toxic metabolite and not clearing it, and I'm menopausal, which is when most breast cancer cases happen, well, guess what? When I'm menopausal, I no longer have a menstrual cycle. These toxic metabolites that I'm not clearing that well, but still producing, where do they go? The body stores them in fatty tissue. Where do women have fatty tissue? In the breasts, in the hips. What's in the breast that was never meant to deal with this level of toxicity if you have the 4 or 16 hydroxy? It's all that glandular, like all the glands and everything that's going on, that literally the cellular structure was not designed. The lungs, the gut, first line of defense. They were designed to deal with that kind of toxic insult and actually clear and filter and send things to the liver to metabolize. Breast? No, it wasn't. And this is why you have all of a sudden 85% of North American women, at least at some point or for a long period, on a birth control pill, which adds to that estrogen pool, which adds to that metabolite that is difficult to clear. How many more women that get past sort of the fertility age into menopausal age now start taking hormone replacement therapy without understanding their cascade? And again, adding more to this pool, which adds more to this pool, which then becomes hard to clear. That toxic insult becomes exaggerated. How many mimics do we have? How many foods do we eat that are estrogen dominant? And again, add to this pool, which adds to this pool, which becomes hard to clear. So this is one example of how you take a simple disease, like, well, I shouldn't call it simple, but something that we treat as very simple, saying, hey, genetically, if you have the BRCA gene, you have a higher propensity for breast cancer. And that scares women. Versus, why does breast cancer happen? Let's not bring it down to the simplicity of gene equals disease, which is the case for things like sickle cell syndromes, non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. These are genetic conditions where a genetic switch needs to be turned on or off, and there's companies out there that are doing really great work to create genetic therapeutics to turn those switches on or off, right? But that's this much of healthcare. 90% of we said is chronic disease. You're not born with type 2 diabetes. You're not born with cholesterol problems. You're not born with breast cancer. Why does most disease happen in and around the age of 50? And then by the age of 60, the average American has 2. Because it takes that long of mismatching your habits, your environment, nutrition, lifestyle habits, those loads that you're putting on your cells that you're genetically were not designed to deal with, to lead to the cellular inflammation that leads to the disease eventually. So this is what we've been working on. And this applies, you name a chronic condition, you can think at this level. So you can think beyond the symptom masking. You can think beyond cholesterolemia is a disease that we need to treat with statin or Lipitor to get rid of the cholesterol. Why is the cholesterolemia happening? It's inflammation in the endothelial lining, which can be predetermined genetically. It's the inability to clear the free radicals and oxidative stress that causes that inflammation that then leads to cholesterol being deployed to reduce the inflammation. So we can test a 5-year-old child and understand that this is their hormonal pathway, this is their cardiovascular pathway, this is their detox, methylation, anti-inflammatory pathway, and start to predict that if these are your environment, nutrition, and lifestyle choices, you're likely to get ABC disease. But guess what? As we always said, this is an 80% likelihood, which means 20% didn't get it. So let's also look at what their habits are. The same suboptimal profile, but they didn't get the disease. So what were they doing right? And that's an area we ignore. And if we start to focus on that and bring and draw in more of those right choices and plug them in, we start to prevent and reverse disease. And in our research, we've done this. We've taken people with chronic conditions like cholesterolemia, like breast cancer, like diabetes, and not only treated, but reverse the conditions. We've seen things coming in people and help prevent. So how do you now translate this into anti-aging? It starts up here. The same way you can determine the cellular structure of all the various components that make us and understand how prone they are to disease. You can also understand the neural wiring or your neurochemicals based on your genetics, meaning when it comes to dopamine, pleasure and reward, how do I experience pleasure? Am I entrepreneurial? Am I more laid back and not seeking reward? When it comes to noradrenaline, am I susceptible to PTSD and trauma and fear? Or am I more going to surge ahead? When it comes to serotonin, your ability to regulate your mood and deal with anxiety, and deal with constant irritability, how do you deal with those things? When it comes to your mood in general, brain-derived neurotropic factor, and your ability to develop new skills, and your ability to cope with traumas like a legal letter in the mail. We start there when we look at anti-aging, and if we understand the human brain, you can then understand how you perceive everything around you. What would cause the stress and the cortisol, and what would cause you to go in this direction or that direction. Then we bring in cellular structure. And we start to say, again, taking this functional approach, no single gene that is the anti-aging switch, but how do you deal with oxidative stress? What are you doing in terms of the SOD2 gene, and how well does your mitochondria actually clear oxidation, which would then lead to cellular stress, which would lead to that rapid aging, the faster wrinkles, the hair going white earlier, because you're not, again, dealing with that load, or incapable because of your genetics. What would then lead to the ability for you to have sort of better bone health and your vitamin D cascade? It's not as simple as taking a blood test and saying, yeah, you have enough vitamin D in the blood, but guess what? That's step one. You also need to transport the vitamin D to the cell where it's actually used. There's a different gene. You may have the best gene to take vitamin D out of the sun and out of food, put it in the blood, but do you actually transport and utilize it? Then there's another gene to actually bind it at the cell. Now that you've got it there, you actually have to use it. And for some people for whom you test their blood and say, yeah, you have enough vitamin D, bone health should not be a problem. But meanwhile, there's an anomaly of they still ended up with osteoporosis. There's still a problem. That could all be prevented if you understood the full cascade as opposed to gene siloed or segmented approaches. You can also look at the FOX3 gene, a simple gene that looks at how do you deal with breaking down the proteins that would lead to rapid aging, that can cross the blood-brain barrier, that can cause things like Alzheimer's and dementia. Is your body metabolizing those things, or are they free-flowing and crossing that blood-brain barrier? So there's a lot of things we can look at, and it starts with first understanding biochemistry. What does the body actually do? Then instead of looking at genetics in the context of genetic conditions, meaning this gene means this, how do you then mirror and match the biochemistry to understand the full cascade for each process? From there, you can then start to understand what are the environment, nutrition, lifestyle loads that would impact that cellular cascade that would lead to a suboptimal outcome or a positive outcome. And from there, you can start to manage chronic disease and aging from a preventative or disease reversal perspective, because you're now dealing with a root cause, several layers before the symptom. And this is why, as I close, why we call these things chronic disease, because they're not acute in nature where it started today. The thing you're experiencing started 7, 10, 15 years ago when you started to make the wrong choices. That cellular load that eventually leads to inflammatory level where you can't handle it and expresses as disease takes that long to achieve. So this is how we say that you can dive into genetics a little bit more, understand it functionally, be able to treat chronic conditions, but also look at it in terms of how do you apply this to aging and slow that aging process down.
Thank you so much, Kashif. Very interesting. For those of you in attendance today who have any questions about Kashif or the DNA company, please pop those into the Q&A box below, and we'll do our best to address as many as possible during the panel discussion a little bit later today. Thank you once again, Kashif. It's a pleasure.
Thank you.